If we get a good summation of EPSPs, then we're able to generate an action potential. That is to say, we depolarize the cell and it is not capable of firing because it does not carry a charge. And what happens when we get an action potential? In this module, we will learn about the conduction of action potentials, how they are produced, and what happens after they are produced. We'll look at how they conduct through the axon and how we end up generating what we call neurotransmitters. In reference to the conduction of action potentials, we at some point believed that APs were generated at the axon hillock, which is the cone-like structure at the junction between the cell body and the axon. But we now know that they're actually generated in an adjacent section of the axon, and this is what we call the axon initial segment. We'll talk about this a little bit more later. The all or none law basically is important for us to keep in mind in this module, and that is when the threshold is reached, the neuron fires and the action potential either occurs or it does not, depending on the summation of EPSPs. We know that when the threshold is reached, the voltage activated ion channels are going to start opening up, and we'll talk about these in a little bit more detail right now. And by channels, we're talking about those channel proteins in the membrane. Also, keep in mind that threshold would be negative 65 millivolts. A lot of activity is happening when a cell is in resting potential. And we know that there is sodium and potassium coming in and out with chloride and ion maintaining things at equilibrium. However, when there are enough EPSPs, a threshold is reached, and that is negative 65, and the voltage-activated ion channels are open. And so we start looking at sodium here. That opens up completely. This would allow for the cell to continue to receive more and more and more sodium inside. When you have more sodium, which are positively charged, then the cell or the inside of the cell starts becoming less and less negative till it reaches the point of positivity. In addition, the potassium channels are also maintained open, where the potassium floods the inside of the cell. However, once it reaches 50 millivolts, the sodium channels begin to close. This would then bring the voltage down, and it actually does so quickly. And when you reach about negative 69, negative 68, we start seeing the potassium channels also begin to close. And the reason why is because now the cell went from negative to being very positive. When you have too much positivity, the inside anions, which is the chloride, start calling in the positive ions inside again. And so we are making the inside more and more negative and more negative and more negative, so the potassium channels start to close, and eventually, temporarily, it reaches a point of hyperpolarization, which would be the point through which it is difficult to get the cell to fire again. So here again, you see the rising phase where the channels open. You see the repolarization phase with the channels, both potassium and sodium, closing, and then you see the hyperpolarization during which, again, the cell is temporarily put out of commission. Please note that this is occurring within a fraction of a second. This is occurring within milliseconds. So it's not like your neuron is off for minutes or for hours. After the neuron fired, the neurons go through refractory periods. And refractory periods are basically those during which it is impossible to initiate another action potential, or where it is just simply more difficult to initiate another action potential. The absolute refractory period is the period during which it is impossible to initiate an action potential. And this lasts between 1 to 2 milliseconds after the initiation of first action potential. Relative refractory period is a period in which it is more difficult to initiate another action potential. We know and recognize now that although it is difficult, it is possible to initiate another one, but we would require higher levels of stimulation, meaning that the EPSP would need to be more intense or larger. It is also important for us to know that action potentials only travel in one direction, and that is away from the body. They don't travel toward the body. Action potentials and PSPs, which come in the form of EPSP and IPSP, differ in the way they are conducted through the axon. We know that PSPs are conducted through the axon in a decremental fashion. That is to say that they grow weaker as they travel along the axonal membrane. Once generated instantly, they kind of cruise until they fade, meaning they get weaker as they get better. They climax at some point. You may remember that we went through that process and then it went lower. Whereas action potentials are non-decremental. It means they do not grow weaker as they travel along the axonal membrane. And they are conducted in an active and passive conduction. Rather than passive where they just kind of cruise until it fades, they actually start off actively and then may travel passively along the axon. And this continues to be repeated. At this point, I'd like you to think back to chapter 3 where we talked about the nodes of Ranvier and the pockets of myelination found along the axon. Think about how myelination is used for the increase of speed of the impulse. And so when we have myelination, it increases the speed. Where we do not have myelination, such as nodes of Ranvier, we decrease that speed. And so that's where with action potentials we have active and passive conductions. We also know that PSPs are fast, whereas action potentials are conducted more slowly than PSPs. I'd like you to think of PSPs as a short engine that is able to generate a fast takeoff, like in a sports car or a motorcycle. And I'd like you to think of action potentials as a bigger engine, such as a big truck, a big 18-wheeler, that although the engine is bigger, the pistons have to travel a longer distance, and because of that, while it has a lot more torque, it does not have a fast takeoff. Here we can appreciate the rendition of the conduction of action potentials through the axon. You can see the first step here where the PSPs are elicited on the cell body and dendrites. So here's a presynaptic neuron, another presynaptic neuron, and these together send their message, which are conducted in a decremental fashion, meaning they're kind of getting weaker as they're getting there, cruising. But if the summation is strong enough, then we start seeing that the PSPs combined exceed the threshold of excitation of negative 65, and then an AP, action potential, is triggered. This would travel in a passive and an active way. Here you see that if, let's assume that this one here has myelination, it would go in an active way. There's a force constantly pushing that. However, here it'd be a node of Ranvier, and it would be a passive, and it would get weaker. But then it gets picked up again by another pocket of myelination, and it continues in a non-decremental fashion down to the terminal button. Once this action potential then reaches the terminal buttons, then the arrival of these in here triggers what we call exocytosis. And exocytosis would be the process of the release of a neurotransmitter. In other words, the process by which the contents of a cell vacuole, which is a storage bubble found in a cell, is released to the exterior through fusion of the vacuole with a cell membrane. And we'll show you what that looks like in future slides. Here you have a summary of the conduction of action potentials through myelinated axons. Remember, passive conduction is when there's an instant and decremental generation of the action potential along each myelin segment. Any myelinated pocket is going to then have passive conduction next to the node of Ranvier. This is the only axonal part where ions can actually pass through, and this is due to the higher concentration of axonal sodium channels. So we know that in the axon, which also has a membrane, we see that there's a lot more presence of sodium channels. At each node of Ranvier, we are generating a new action potential. And although this action potential is carried on through until the terminal button, we know that the signal may weaken slightly throughout its process, but for the most part remains strong enough to generate another full action potential as it goes on to the next node. So again, please note that along the myelinated pockets, we have passive conduction, and at each node, we have an active conduction of the action potential. Overall, myelination increases the speed of axonal conduction, and again, the conduction is a passive one, meaning it only occurs instantly, and it cruises down thereafter, jumping from node to node. The fascinating questions that arise from understanding this in here, and the answers can help us understand our capacities as human beings. One of the fascinating questions has been as to the speed of the action potentials along the axon. And the answer really depends on two properties of the axon. First, looking at how wide the diameter of the axon is, and we find that there is a faster conduction when there is a larger diameter axon. And this just makes sense. If you have a 6-lane highway versus a 1-lane highway, it'd be safer to travel through this 6-lane highway, and also many other cars could travel at faster speeds through a 6-lane highway than a 1-lane highway. Another thing we have to look at is whether the axon is myelinated. And so the myelination, or the level of myelin that is found in the axon, will also impact the speed through which the action potential travels. In mammalian motor neurons, these are basically motor neurons that synapse on skeletal muscles. These are large and myelinated, so some of these can actually conduct at speeds of 100 meters per second. That would be the equivalent of about 224 miles per hour. In contrast, we have small unmyelinated axons that conduct action potentials at about 1 meter per second. There is a misconception about the velocity of motor neuron action potentials in humans. The maximum velocity of motor neuron APs was found to be about 100 meters per second in cats, and was then assumed to be the same in humans, but we now know that it is not. The maximum velocity of conduction in human motor neurons is about 60 meters per second. And this can be appreciated in our reflexes, or our behavior. Whereas a cat would be very fast to turn even mid-air to land on their feet, and to have a fast takeoff in speed, and to jump up walls, we as humans, as active and as athletic as we may be, would pale in comparison to the behavior of cats. This influence in the conduction of action potentials through the axon cannot be negated as influential in these differences in behavior.